This is Pennsylvania Inside Out on WPSU TV. Here's tonight's host, Patty Satalia.
Best-selling author and New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman has rattled the rafters of Christianity. A graduate of the conservative Christian Moody Bible Institute with a Master's of Divinity and a Ph.D. from Princeton Theological Seminary, he now chairs the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's the author or editor of 20 books on early Christianity and the history of the Bible. He's also an agnostic. In his new book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why, he picks apart the Gospels that made him a disbeliever. We'll talk with him about current debates over Scripture and about why he came to regard his earlier faith in the perfect inspiration of the Bible as misguided. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Your book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why, explores how scribes, through both omission and intention, changed the Bible. But before we find out how the New Testament came to be what it is today, I'm a little bit curious about what the impetus was for writing the book.
Well, this is a field of study that I've been engaged in for 30 years. When I started off in my research, I got interested in the New Testament and especially how we got the New Testament. The thing that struck me after working on this for about 30 years is that people at large don't know anything about this area, even though it's so important. Many people just assume that we got the Bible by, I don't know, the Bible descended from heaven one day a few weeks after Jesus died. But in fact, it didn't work that way. The Bible was copied over decades and then centuries, and we don't have the originals. We have copies made many centuries later, and there are differences among these copies. And so this is something that scholars work on, trying to figure out what the original said, given the fact we don't have the originals but only mistaken copies. But what occurred to me is that nobody had ever written a book for a popular audience for this. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write something that would be understood by people who don't know the original Greek language or other ancient languages, but simply want to know about how we got our New Testaments.
You wrote in the introduction of the book that this was the most important books of any, to you personally, of any that you'd written, and there are some 20 in all. It's been on your mind, as you said, for the past 30 years, since your late teens when you first began studying the New Testament. Tell us a little bit about your own personal religious journey.
Well, I was raised in an Episcopal church, but when I was in high school, I had a born-again experience and became an evangelical Christian, which is why I went off then to Moody Bible Institute, which is a very conservative, fundamentalist Bible college, which I enjoyed at the time. And this was a place that emphasized that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God. There are no mistakes in the Bible of any kind. And that's what I accepted then for a number of years. But then, as I went on after Moody and went to another college, went to Wheaton College to do my bachelor's degree, I learned Greek. And I started reading the New Testament in the original Greek language. And I started being troubled by the fact that we didn't actually have the original text of the New Testament, because it started making less sense to me to say that the words of the New Testament had been inspired by God if there are places where we don't have the words. Because why would God bother inspiring the words so that we would have them if, in fact, He hadn't preserved the words that we really would have them? And so this started forcing me to rethink a lot of my evangelical beliefs, and it started leading me away then from fundamentalist Christianity.
In fact, you said you lost your last shred of faith while you were teaching a class at Rutgers. How painful was it for you, in a way, to have suddenly realized, I don't believe what I've believed for all these years?
Right. Well, it is extremely painful, or was extremely painful. It's not painful anymore, because now I really think that I have a better insight into the world and into people and our place in the world. And what actually led me away from the faith wasn't so much the problem with the Bible. What led me away from the faith was the problem of suffering in the world, that there's so much misery and suffering in the world that I think can't be explained if, in fact, there's a good and all-powerful God who's in charge of it. And that happens to be the subject of the next book, the one I'm writing right now, in fact. We get another important book to me. It was very painful for me, though, because in part I'd been thinking for years and years that if you didn't have the beliefs I had, that you would spend eternity in hell. Well, that's a very deeply rooted kind of belief, and if you no longer then are in the fold and you've left the fold and you have this belief in eternal punishment, that can be very painful, obviously.
How were the 27 books of the New Testament cobbled together, and by whom? And if they are not accurate, are we talking about heretics or orthodox who made the changes that you've pointed out?
Well, the thing to recognize is that in early Christianity there were lots of different books written by lots of different Christians. We know the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there were other Gospels written by other people. So we have, today still, we have Gospels allegedly by Jesus' disciple Thomas, by Philip, by Judas Iscariot now, just recently discovered, Mary Magdalene, a whole range of Gospels, probably about 40 Gospels that didn't make it in. And so the question is naturally, why did we get these 4 and what happened to the others? As it turns out, it's not what most people think. Most people think that there must have been some kind of church council. Some people think that the Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea to have a vote about which books would be in the New Testament, but it didn't work that way. The Council of Nicaea didn't take any vote about the books of the New Testament, nor did any other council. What happened is, over time, there were different Christian groups that had different sets of beliefs, and these different groups were trying to win converts. And eventually, one of the groups succeeded in establishing itself as the orthodox way of looking at the religion. And this is the group that ended up writing the creeds that continue to be recited down to today. And this is the group that decided which books would be in. And so eventually, around the end of the 4th century, so about 300 years after the books had been written, around the end of the 4th century, most Christians of the Orthodox persuasion agreed on these 27.
You say that the Gospel of John, the cornerstone of the Christian faith, which really explains his life and resurrection and death, you say that it is very different from Luke, and Mark. How so, and why is that important?
Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sometimes called the synoptic Gospels because you can actually put those 3 in parallel columns next to each other and see the same stories and read the stories against each other. With John, you can't do that because John has so many different stories. And the question is, why does John have stories not found in the other 3, and why doesn't it have the stories that are in the other 3? And what scholars have thought for many centuries, in fact, this is an idea that goes back to the early church, is that John is the last gospel to be written, and it is less concerned with giving historically reliable information and more concerned about giving a theological understanding of who Jesus is. And so even in the early church, John was called the spiritual gospel because it was so different from the other 3.
In misquoting Jesus, you cast doubt on any number of New Testament stories, episodes that are really sort of the cornerstone of Christian belief. One example, one of the most famous stories in the Bible, deals with a crowd that's ready to stone an adulterous woman to death, and Jesus leans down, doodles in the dust, and then says, "Let the one without sin cast the first stone." The crowd backs off. You say that story is likely fiction.
Well, absolutely. And, I didn't come up with this idea. In fact, scholars have known for several centuries now that this story, which is, I think, probably the most popular story in the Gospels, this story wasn't originally in the Gospel of John. This isn't just an opinion. The reality is that we have a lot of manuscripts of the Gospel of John, and in none of the early manuscripts can you find the story. Moreover, we have church fathers who wrote commentaries on the Gospel of John in the early church. We don't have any Greek commentators. It was originally written in Greek. We don't have any Greek commentators on the Gospel of John who mention the story for 1,000 years. So the question is, where did the story come from?
Who added it and why?
Yeah, well, we wish we knew. But my hunch, and again, this is a hunch that a lot of scholars who work on this have, is that there was a scribe who had heard the story, maybe heard it through the oral tradition, and thought that it well represented some of the things Jesus was saying in John chapter 7. And so he wrote it as a marginal note in a manuscript. And then a second scribe came along later and saw this marginal note and thought, oh, he left out a story. And then he put it in his manuscript manuscript, and then that manuscript got copied over the centuries until it became a popular story, and then was included in our English Bibles because it was included in the King James translation.
Now, in researching your book, you spent years reading texts from the Old Testament. We're talking about in ancient Greek, without punctuation, without capitalization, thousands and thousands of pages. How arduous an ordeal was that? And
yes, well, it's not for the faint of heart. It's this is a difficult field of study, but a very important field of study, and it's there aren't that many people who engage in it because, in fact, frankly, it's rather boring. I mean, reading Greek manuscripts is not the most exciting thing you can do on a Friday night, but it is extremely important because the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and since we don't have the original manuscripts, all we have are later manuscripts, we have to look at these manuscripts and compare them with one another to know where there are differences among them. And what most people don't realize are that there are thousands and thousands of differences among these manuscripts. Well, somebody has to find these differences and point out what they are so we can know, well, what are the differences and what are the originals. And that's what a textual critic does.